Welcome. My name is Rachel Watson, and I am so fortunate to be a part of a group of inspired Wyomingites who are working towards elevating the sciences in botany, molecular biology, physics, zoology, physiology, chemistry, and the life program toward a top quartile status. And there's two parts of that. Obviously, one is the benchtop science, the research, but the other part is the science of teaching and learning, and that's where I come in. I'm very fortunate to be the interim point person for the LAMP program, Learning Actively Mentorship Program, illuminating the path to success in the sciences. So the LAMP program is a program looking at the training of faculty and graduate students and outreach involved with learning how to teach in an active way. And this begins the very first of what I will call LAMP LiteBytes, little vodcasts that allow us to talk about active learning and allow all of us to learn a little bit of something in the process. Now, for many, many years, passive learning has been the type of learning that we have seen in many of our science classrooms. Not all, some of them do a fabulous job of active learning, but in many cases, we see a lot of passive or empty vessel type learning. That is the idea that if we talk, then students will open up their brain and will pour in the knowledge and they'll soak it all up like a sponge and they'll know everything that we know. Now, this idea, this transfer theory, actually published about is not so much of the truth. And instead, we know that students learn much more deeply when we use active learning. Quite simply, active learning can be defined as an instructional method that engages students in their own learning processes. Sounds like a win-win situation. Students are involved, we're involved. Now, active learning is quite a spectrum. There are a lot of different ways to engage students in their learning. And while this looks like an overwhelming list of those methods, in fact, this is very much just scratching the surface. And there are so many active learning methods that perhaps we will discover as we go through these LAMP LiteBytes. However, my goal for these LAMP LiteBytes is to take you through one of these each week. We'll do that starting next week. And these are ranging in perhaps the amount of energy that you would have to invest in order to make them happen in your classroom. And that's why I'm showing this on a spectrum. No hierarchy intended, but instead, perhaps it takes a little bit more energy to design an entirely place-based or service learning course, whereas maybe it takes a little less energy to just start inserting pauses into your lecture. However, it can be very effective. You probably wish I would pause right now, right? Just so you could think and maybe write something down. And that's something we forget to do in the lecture. Perhaps pausing, allowing the students to write a 1-minute paper, maybe allowing them to think about what we're saying, pair with another student, discuss it, and then share with the large group. We're going to talk about a lot of these techniques throughout the weeks to come. Now, active learning is not new. It's not new at all. And in fact, this is a picture from the medieval era, and we can see that this is a key active learning exercise. That is the apprenticeship. We're seeing that the baker is teaching someone how to bake bread, and this is very active, right? Engaged in the very riveting process of putting the bread into the oven. So this obviously is not new, and in fact, in ancient Greece, we can think back to Plato and Socrates, and in fact, we even think about the Socratic method of questioning as being certainly a two-way street, and one that involves active engagement from the learner. This is a quote from a 2004 article. Greek orators would take walks on familiar paths in order to remember ideas for their speeches. They would associate different statues along their walk with the different topics that they would be discussing during their speeches. Very much an active learning exercise. However, as we can see, at the same time that there was apprenticeships happening in medieval Europe, it is also in the Middle Ages that we started to see the classroom shift. Instead of being sort of a style in which there was a surrounding engagement of the learner with the speaker, in the Middle Ages we began to see these linear rows of students with the sage on the stage, the instructor being out in front and inaccessible to the learner. This is something that kept prevailing throughout the birth of the university and certainly into our current era. When we look at the design for this sort of university amphitheater, we can all think of lecture halls in which we've taught where we've seen that exact same setup. In fact, that's the norm. Right now, I teach in the agriculture auditorium, and it is an auditorium. Fortunately, it has a flat floor, so I can run around everywhere and be everywhere, but it is still an auditorium. So the question is, how do we change that in the future? And that is one of the goals. But one has to think to oneself that there had to have been brilliant scholars in the mid-20th century and early 20th century that began from a learning theory point of view to question the efficacy of this sort of design of a classroom and this sort of unidirectional passive learning. There absolutely were. Now, you'll notice that these are the four main learning theories out there. However, I've crossed off behaviorism. Most of you are pretty familiar with Pavlov's dogs, the idea that learning is only overtly manifested in behavior. Now, that was pretty quickly critiqued. In fact, in 1928, the Gestalt philosophers began to say, hey, wait a minute. Behavior is not the only manifestation of learning, or we should say that there's so much more going on within the learner's mind. There's a scaffold of knowledge that they are constructing and reconstructing and redesigning with all that they learn. The learner thinks, this is a quote from Miriam, the learner thinks about all the ingredients necessary to solve a problem and puts them together cognitively. So getting a view into the mind of the scholar, of the learner, and thinking about how those pieces are being put together. Now, cognitivism was very much informed by the Gestalt philosophers, but when we start to think about social cognitivism, Jean Piaget comes to mind in the mid-20th century, and he began to think about something called social cognitivism. That it's not just biology, it's not just essentialism that leads to the construction and reconstruction within a learner's mind, but that it's their environment that also plays a role in that. And very much that incorporates the teacher. So this is sort of the root of the idea of teacher as role model. The old adage, do as I say, not as I do. We know it never works. Students do what we do. We are their role models. And that is an incredibly important part of teaching and learning. Also, the idea of self-efficacy began to come around at this time. Arthur Bandera saying that if a learner feels confident about their knowledge, that changes their likelihood of success. This is huge. Now, this begins to give rise to this idea of humanism. This is my favorite learning philosophy and one to which I prescribe avidly. This is the idea that we might refuse to accept the notion that behavior is predetermined by either the environment or one's subconscious. Rather, human beings can control their own destiny. People are inherently good and will strive for a better world. People possess unlimited potential for growth and development. This is where we think about transformational learning, learning that changes the entire world of the learner. And it might be utopic, but it certainly is something that I believe very much in. And in fact, this situates in two very brilliant scholars. Carl Rogers is really the father of the idea of student-centered learning. And that's what active learning is all about. It's all about putting the learner at the center of the learning and not the professor. So while you might know your stuff really darn well, if the student doesn't necessarily absorb that, and we need to put them at the center of the learning. Now, Maslow is also credited with some of the origins of humanism. Remember Maslow's hierarchy. This is huge. Because if a learner doesn't feel safe, if a learner is not fed, if a learner doesn't have shelter, then a learner cannot reach self-actualization, much less to say the actualization of the earth, perhaps as a suspected added level to Maslow's hierarchy. And so we have to make classrooms feel safe. Now, lastly, I want to talk a little bit about constructivism. Over the past decade or so, constructivism has gotten a lot of attention. It too is at the root of active learning because it talks about connected learning, self-directed learning, learning through dialogue. Really, constructivism looks at this idea that the learner constructs meaning, that the environment matters in that construction because they're constantly interacting in a dynamic feedback loop with the environment. So this is a very active process, and in all ways, constructivist ideas are active ideas. So in many of these philosophical origins to active learning, we could say that we can already begin to tell that teaching and facilitating student active learning is an imperative. And in fact, we need to look at some of the reasons for that, but I want to begin by saying that we are a bit different than other active learning efforts that are on campus. And first, I want to acknowledge that there is a lot of phenomenal active learning going on the University of Wyoming campus. In fact, I have seen active learning from pharmacy, from education, from the College of Agriculture, from every niche on the campus where people are doing phenomenal things. But what's interesting is most of those phenomenal things are done on a small scale. And in the sciences, we define that as 45, even 50 or less students. But when we start to look at large STEM gateway courses, wow, we start to see a lot more auditorium-style learning. So we're looking to try to facilitate large-scale quality active learning in the STEM gateways courses. And we think this is an imperative. For example, there was a quote by Clarissa Dirks, co-chair of the U.S. National Academy's Scientific Teaching Alliance. At this point, it's unethical to teach any other way. Why? Because we know there's accumulating literature, and don't try to read all that literature over on the side in one fell swoop, but we know that active learning increases academic success, understanding, and retention, decreases failure rates, increases inclusion and diversity, big one for me, increased global citizenry, increased engagement, increased motivation to learn, increased science professional skills, increased likelihood to learn throughout a lifetime, increased interaction and esteem, increased long-term achievement. Whoa. It is an imperative. And it's important to note that spaces matter. In a publication by Park and Choi in 2014, this quote, "The classroom is one of the key elements that supports student learning." Or 1993, one of the leading figures in environmental studies, including environmental education and environmental design, argues that academic architecture possesses its own hidden curriculum. Hence, learning is influenced by how classrooms are designed and constructed. Huge. So, throughout the fall of 2015 and even part of the summer of 2015, I chaired the Active Learning Spaces Committee, and with help from so many inspired educators, we planned 4 large active learning classrooms for the new proposed building. These classrooms would hold 50, 100, 150, and 200 students. We were influenced by some incredible site visits that we took to Phoenix and to the University of Minnesota, pictured in the lower right here. University of Minnesota is one of 250 colleges and universities around the US that have adopted Scale Up. Scale Up, you might have guessed it, stands for student-centered. The most important part, student-centered, active learning environments. And so this initiative is setting the trend in this sort of pedagogy. And what you can see, pedagogy, I'm going to use that word a lot in my podcast. That means the art and science of teaching and learning, very sexy-minded way to put it. But what we see in this design are tables of 9 where students can interact with one another dynamically. They can plug into an LCD, display their computers. They can also get up right on the whiteboard. They can go to town getting around the room, maybe doing something we call a gallery walk. Well, they would draw on one whiteboard, then the next, 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 and they get around the whole room. The professor can usurp one of their computers, put it on the large screen, can display more than one computer on the large screen. Whew, it's dynamic. It is rad. Fantastic. And yes, that is a technical word. Look it up in the Urban Dictionary. So facilities planning, we have been going through a lot of that. And we have designed these rooms according to the best pedagogical underpinnings and worked intimately with the architects. So we have planned classrooms that implement this student-centered sort of design, and they are ready to be up and going. Overall programmatic goals, though, let's look at that, because spaces are essential, right? We talked about how spaces, and when we toured University of Minnesota, they talked repeatedly about if you build it, then they will change. And that is the idea that when we have the right amenable spaces for active learning, that pedagogy or the teaching styles that professors use sort of automatically follow that space. However, it is essential, and this was quoted by so many of those that we spoke with, to also train faculty. We need to train faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, and have an outreach with that training as well. And our goal, train all new Science Initiative faculty and graduate students and most of the existing Science Initiative faculty in active learning by 2022. Shh, don't tell, but I think we can do it even sooner. Our specific programmatic objectives, we're going to try to hire 2 full-time APL instructional facilitators who have advanced degrees in the STEM field, extensive experience, demonstrable teaching and educational research success. We want to expand that ALS committee, the one I said that I had been chairing. Well, we're already doing it. We're sending out tendrils. We're starting to invite new people. We're already engaging in bi-weekly sort of meetings where we're talking about everything ranging from spaces to practices, and we're engaging that same cohort, we hope, in an institute this summer. We've already begun discussion on that institute. I've been up to my eyeballs with the K through 16 Science Summit in Casper. If you haven't already heard about that summit, please do come. There's a lot of active learning stuff planned, and we're going to have a fabulous time, a lot of learning to be had at the summit in Casper on the 19th. Contact me for more information. We're going to expand the graduate seminar. It's called Garden Club. We're going to build enrollment in undergraduate seminar courses. Guess what? We've already done that, and we're already running those in a different way where we're teaching the TAs, the undergraduate TAs, how to teach in an active style. And eventually, once we get these active learning spaces, we're planning to visit those spaces for debrief sessions and discussion sessions after observing faculty teaching in those spaces. But we have some barriers. We have to clearly define our uniqueness. That is, we have to have some way of talking about our effort as being large scale. So we've come up with some ideas, including one that I thought of, cowboy scale up, because, you know, cowboy up, well, it's cowboy scale up. And there have been some others that have come up as well. Facilitating active learning lectures, right? So we're really getting to the idea that it's the large lecture halls where we're trying to change. So some of these are great. Additionally, we need to clearly communicate our goals. This is one of the efforts towards that in this LiteByte. Turning feelings of exclusion into inclusion. Inclusion is the most important thing in any initiative. And I believe that this particular initiative is already beginning to break down silo barriers. We've established connections with the Elbogen Center for Teaching and Learning, with the College of Education. We've been reaching out throughout campus and building bridges, and we hope we can build many, many more, because this initiative will impact every department on campus. We will touch 70% of the undergraduate students. We will touch all of the teacher education students. So this will be a broadly impactful initiative. Thank you for your time today. It's been a wonderful LiteByte, and I can't wait until next time when we delve into the specific ideas for active learning strategies that you can implement in your classrooms. On that note, have a fantastic day.